In June of 2024, a lab in Tianjin, China grew a living human brain the size of a pinhead, wired it into a robot, and taught it to think. Western headlines called it a threat, Chinese state media called it a world first, and almost nobody explained what the machine actually does, or why 3 separate teams on 3 separate continents built nearly the same thing within months of each other. So here is the real story behind MetaBOC, what it can and cannot do, and why a piece of lab equipment the size of a grain of rice has become part of the same strategic competition as semiconductors and supercomputers. Let's start with the claim everyone got wrong first, because the world's first framing is doing a lot of work it should not be doing. Tianjin University and the Southern University of Science and Technology did not build the first biological computer on Earth. Monash University in Australia had already taught a dish of neurons to play Pong back in 2021. Indiana University had already built a system called BrainAware, which used a brain organoid to recognize spoken vowels months before Tianjin's paper went public. What Tianjin actually built, and what makes the claim scientifically true rather than just a good headline, is the first open-source, full-chain interface system that lets a living brain organoid control a physical robot or a virtual environment in a closed loop, using publicly released code that other labs can copy. It is a first in engineering and standardization, not a first in biology. That distinction matters because it tells you what kind of race this actually is. Here's what the machine physically is, and I want to be precise here because most of the coverage was not. The organoid at the center of MetaBOC is not a brain floating in a jar with wires coming out of it, whatever the illustration on your newsfeed showed you. It is a cluster of roughly 10,000 living neurons, grown from human stem cells about the size of a pinhead. It sits inside a sealed, climate-controlled chamber that keeps it alive with a constant flow of nutrients, oxygen, and fluid at body temperature. That chamber sits on top of a microelectrode array, a chip covered in tiny electrical contact points that can both read the organoid's activity and send small pulses of stimulation into it. The robot on the outside is just a remote body. It gets steered by signals decoded from that living tissue in another room. Here's the sentence worth remembering before we go any further. The robot is a demo. The substrate is the prize. Nobody in this story actually cares about the robot arm picking up a block. What every government watching this cares about is the living tissue underneath it, and whether it represents a new way to compute at all. So why grow a brain instead of just writing more code? This is where the story stops being a curiosity and starts being an actual computing problem worth understanding. A regular computer chip processes information using binary logic, ones and zeros, flipped by transistors billions of times a second. It's incredibly fast and incredibly power-hungry. Training a large, modern artificial intelligence model can burn through the energy output of a small power plant. A living brain does something completely different. Neurons rewire themselves physically in response to what they experience, strengthening some connections and weakening others, using tiny electrochemical signals instead of a fire hose of electricity. The human brain runs on about 20 watts. That is less power than a household light bulb, and it comfortably outperforms every supercomputer on the planet at tasks like recognizing a face in a crowd or catching a ball. Organoid computing is a bet that if you can harness even a sliver of that efficiency, you can build a new kind of processor that thinks the way a brain does for a fraction of the electricity a data center demands. But if living tissue is this efficient, why isn't every tech company on Earth already doing this? Hold that question, because the answer is exactly where this story gets uncomfortable. Here is how Tianjin's system actually works, step by step, because the process itself is the clever part. Data comes in first, whether that's a robot's proximity sensor or a virtual obstacle course. That data gets translated into a spatial pattern of tiny electrical pulses delivered directly onto the organoid through the microelectrode array. The living tissue reacts. Neurons fire in complex, shifting patterns as the signal ripples through the cluster. A second set of electrodes reads that activity back out, and specialized software decodes the firing pattern into a command, like turn left or grip the object. When the robot succeeds, the system reinforces the pattern that led to that success. When it fails, the loop pushes back with a different stimulus. Over repeated cycles, the organoid's actual physical wiring changes to get better at the task. That is not a metaphor. The tissue is quite literally rewiring itself to do a better job, the same way your brain rewires itself while you're learning to ride a bike. One genuinely underreported detail here, buried under all the robot photos, is where the real engineering breakthrough came from. It was not some radical new algorithm. Tianjin's team discovered that bathing the growing organoid in low-intensity focused ultrasound, sound waves too gentle to damage tissue but strong enough to stimulate it, made the neurons mature faster and form stronger synaptic connections. The actual advance was biological cultivation, not software. Every headline about a robot with a human brain skipped straight past the one detail that was scientifically new. Now here's the uncomfortable truth nobody wants to put in the headline. This thing cannot outperform a $5 smartphone chip. The tasks demonstrated so far are narrow: vowel and speaker recognition, predicting a chaotic mathematical sequence, basic robotic obstacle avoidance, and object tracking. Indiana's competing system hit about 78% accuracy, recognizing 8 different speakers. Which sounds impressive until you remember that a cheap smartphone chip can do the same task with near-perfect accuracy, using a fraction of the setup complexity. These organoids are not outperforming silicon, not even close. What they're proving is that a completely different physical substrate can perform recognizable computation at all, and that the energy cost of doing so, at the level of the tissue itself, is almost immeasurably small. And the limitations don't stop there. They get worse the closer you look. These organoids cannot survive outside a sealed life support chamber for more than a few minutes. Without a constant blood vessel-like flow of oxygen and nutrients, the center of the cluster starves and dies, which physically caps how large any single organoid can grow, somewhere around 2 to 5 millimeters across. The electrodes that read and stimulate the tissue are rigid, hard materials, while living neural tissue is soft as jelly by comparison, which causes physical damage over time and limits how long any single organoid stays useful. No two organoids grow identically either, because they're biological, self-organizing tissue rather than a chip stamped out by a machine, which makes standardizing results across different labs genuinely difficult. And the entire functional lifespan of one of these systems currently tops out somewhere between weeks and a little over 100 days, compared to a silicon chip that will run reliably for years without any structural decay at all. So if this technology is this fragile, underpowered, and short-lived, why is Washington funding it at all? This is where the story stops being about biology and starts being about power. No one in the United States government has officially labeled organoid computing a military threat. There is no declassified assessment, no congressional testimony, no policy paper that says China has weaponized living brain tissue. That framing came from tech blogs and headline writers, not from the Pentagon. But underneath the sensational framing sits a real and serious strategic question. Silicon chip manufacturing is running into hard physical limits. Transistors are already approaching the size of a few atoms, and every new generation of chip gets more expensive and more difficult to shrink further. If silicon scaling hits a wall this decade, and there is real technical debate about whether it already has, then whichever nation leads in an entirely different computing substrate, biological or otherwise, could sidestep the entire silicon supply chain competition altogether. That includes the export controls, the fabrication plant bottlenecks, and the years of manufacturing lead time that currently define the semiconductor race between the United States and China. This is why the American National Science Foundation has already put $14 million behind 7 university research teams studying organoid computing, from Harvard to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. It is not because anyone thinks a rogue brain robot is coming. It's because whoever solves the biology problem first inherits a completely new axis of computing leverage. One that does not depend on a single fabrication plant in Taiwan or a single export control list out of Washington. Picture that for a second. Not a data center packed with humming silicon racks, but rows of sealed, sterile chambers glowing faintly at body temperature, each one keeping a fragment of living tissue alive to think on command. That is the future this research is quietly betting on, however far off it still is. China's approach here fits a much longer pattern too, and it's worth understanding on its own. Tianjin's brain-computer interface work did not appear out of nowhere in 2024. It sits inside a 15-year national research program called the China Brain Project, launched back in 2016, which named brain-inspired computing a core strategic priority for the country. Tianjin has since opened the nation's first undergraduate degree program specifically built around brain-computer interface engineering, training a domestic talent pipeline years before this technology has any hope of commercial use. That is not the behavior of a country chasing a viral headline. That is the behavior of a country making a multi-decade bet on a specific area of science, the same way it has made multi-decade bets on rare earth processing, battery chemistry, and semiconductor self-sufficiency. And here's the detail that complicates the simple rivalry narrative, so it's worth sitting with. American and Chinese researchers on this exact technology have published cooperative, cross-referenced work together, and at least 4 different countries, the United States, China, Australia, and Switzerland, all reached functionally similar breakthroughs within about 6 months of each other, largely independently. This was not one country racing ahead of a sleeping rival. It was several labs solving the same hard problem in parallel, because the underlying science was finally ready to be solved. So where does this actually go from here? In the near term, expect 0 commercial products. This remains laboratory research, full stop. In the medium term, the most credible use case is medical, not computational. Growing an organoid from an individual patient's own cells and using it to test how that specific person's neurons respond to a drug before a doctor ever prescribes it is a genuinely realistic application within the coming decade. In the long term, the real prize was never the robot. It's figuring out how a living neural network organizes itself to solve problems using almost no power at all, and then borrowing those biological design principles to build better, more efficient silicon chips, the kind that could ease the massive energy demands of the artificial intelligence boom currently straining power grids worldwide. If there's one thing worth remembering after all of this, it's that the real story was never about a robot with a human brain stapled to its chest. It was about which nations are willing to fund the unglamorous, decades-long science that might someday replace the chip in your phone, long before any of it pays off. Right now, at least 4 of them are betting on it at the same time. If you want the full breakdown of how the underlying semiconductor race got here in the first place, and why every major power is suddenly hedging on non-silicon computing at once, that's exactly what the next video on this channel covers. Go check it out, because this story only makes sense once you understand what's actually running out on the silicon side.